Hello and welcome to my session as part of the Global Schools Festival. I'm Susannah Reid and it's great to be here with you all today. I hope you're enjoying the festival as much as I am so far. The title of my session is Modern Lessons from Traditional Tales, and it's all about using stories to develop critical thinking skills in our young learners. I'm going to use traditional tales in this talk, in particular versions of three fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm collection, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, and Jack and the Beanstalk. I've chosen these stories because there tend to be versions of them available around the world, including in many schemes of graded English language teaching readers. So you may know these stories already, or would be able to access a version to use in class if you wanted to do any of these activities with your young learners. But of course, you can also apply the same principles to your own favourite stories or traditional tales that are well known in your region. Those of you who know the stories I'm using may notice that I have made a few changes to the plot lines. And I've done this because many traditional tales, including these three, have various problematic elements such as scary villains and plot lines or morally dubious events such as the hero characters killing the villains or stealing their money. So it's worth remembering when using these kinds of stories that you can always change some of the content to bring them up to date or to tailor them to the needs of your class. I've called the session Modern Lessons from These Tales, as critical thinking is one of the key 21st century skills that our young learners need to help them cope in our fast changing and globalised world. And it's been identified as one of the 6 key competencies defined in the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework, which has been developed to help teachers integrate these 21st century skills into their English language classroom. The others being creative thinking, learning to learn, communication, collaboration, and social responsibility. So, what is critical thinking and how can we use stories, which are one of the oldest teaching tools in the world, to help young learners develop this modern 21st century skill? The Cambridge Life Competencies Framework for young learners defines critical thinking as enabling learners to identify patterns and relationships, evaluate ideas, and use these skills to solve problems. I've highlighted patterns, relationships, evaluate ideas, and solve problems in this definition, as these words and phrases will form the core points of how we're going to look at using stories to develop critical thinking skills in this session. We're going to look at how stories help young learners analyse people via the characters and understand the relationships between them, see the patterns in a sequence of events through the plot and understand why things happen, evaluate ideas and use these skills to solve problems following the journey of the characters in the story. For each of these core points, we're going to look at some key reading and thinking strategies with activities that we can apply to the story, and then at some activities that use the same strategies in other contexts to deepen our young learners' understanding of how these skills can be applied to other contexts and areas of their lives. The strategies I'm going to look at in particular are linked to evaluating, examining relationships, patterns, or problem solving, and they are analysing, in this case characters, compare and contrast, point of view, cause and effect, and problem and solution. Many of the activities I describe will use visual organisers, such as mind maps, charts, or Venn diagrams, as these help children to organise their thoughts when asking them to think critically. And importantly, they make critical thinking activities accessible to young learners who are not using their first language. They visibly demonstrate how you want your young learners to organise their thoughts, rather than you having to use complicated language to explain what you are doing using words alone. Plus, of course, they provide useful scaffolding and support when we want our young learners to share their ideas with the rest of the class. So first, let's see how stories can help young learners understand the relationship between people. And of course, working with stories, we do this through the characters. Before students can analyse the relationships between the characters, they need to identify and understand each character on their own. So first, we'll look at how young learners can analyse characters individually. Then we'll go further and analyse the relationships between them, first using the strategy of compare and contrast to understand similarities and differences. And then we will look at helping young learners understand that different people have different points of view, and that stories are often told from just one point of view. Understanding different points of view in a story can affect how we see a character and help us understand why they act as they do. Therefore, we may develop more empathy for the more difficult characters as well as the heroes. I'll look at the stories of Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood to talk about introducing these strategies. So, looking at Hansel and Gretel first, the story has two main characters, Hansel and Gretel, and then the additional characters of the witch and the children's parents. And just to summarise the story briefly here, which I've changed a bit, as some of you may notice. Hansel and Gretel's family are very poor and don't have enough to eat. One day, the children decide to look for food in the forest. Hansel drops bread to make a path so they don't get lost. Birds eat the bread and the path disappears. Hansel and Gretel get lost in the forest and are hungry. They see a gingerbread house and start to eat the windows and doors. An old woman comes out and asks them into the house, but she is a witch. The witch wants to eat them, but Gretel pushes her into a cupboard instead and locks her in. The children find some money and take it back home. We can ask students to analyse the characters of Hansel and Gretel using different kinds of evidence from the story. And we can base this on the characters' actions, what do they do in the story, their words, what do they say, and their feelings, what feelings do they show at different times in the story. So we might ask students to make a mind map for each of the two characters. For example, for Hansel, it might include details like this. For actions, Hansel decides to make a path so that he and Gretel don't get lost in the forest. This shows us he is creative and resourceful, as he thinks of ideas and makes use of what he has, in this case, bread. For words, when Hansel and Gretel are lost in the forest, Hansel comforts Gretel by saying, "Don't worry, Gretel." This shows us he is kind. And for feelings, if we look at how Hansel reacts and seems to feel at different times in the story, we could say he is calm. We could guide students as a class to make mind maps for both Hansel and Gretel using these categories to bring out a deeper understanding of their characters, asking questions as they do so, such as, what does Hansel do? What does this show us about him? What do we call people who have lots of ideas? And so on. Then we want our learners to dig deeper and think about the relationships between the characters. And for this, we can start with using the strategy of compare and contrast, which we use to get students to understand the similarities and differences between things, or people in this case. We could do this using another visual organizer, in this case a Venn diagram, which is great for plotting how things are different and how they are the same. Here I have the characteristics for Hansel to the left of the diagram, Gretel to the right of the diagram, and the characteristics they both share in the overlapping section. So, for example, we may have seen in the story that they are both kind to each other. They are both brave at different times, and they are both resourceful, using what they have around them to solve their problems. Hansel makes more plans, so perhaps he is more creative than Gretel. But Gretel is the one who acts quickly when she pushes the witch into the cupboard. So perhaps she is more quick thinking. Hansel seems to be calmer than Gretel, who comes across as being more worried at different times in the story. And then with this activity, I also like to add a star quality line, focusing on what the students might perceive to be a key strength of each character. And I like to do this to emphasize that as part of our similarities and differences, we all have different strengths. As I think understanding this is such an important part of teaching young learners to collaborate with others. If we can appreciate other people's strengths and understand what they bring to the table, we will all work better together. So, for example, we might give Hansel the star quality of being creative and Gretel the star quality of being quick thinking. And then, of course, we can extend the activity to getting our young learners to think about their own relationships with their classmates. They can think about the similarities and differences between them and also assign a key strength to each student. So they appreciate that everyone is similar in some ways and different in other ways, but also that everyone is special and has their unique strengths to bring to a task. Students could work in pairs or in breakout rooms to compare and contrast themselves with one student and then share their ideas with other pairs, groups, or the class. And then the star qualities or strengths they identify for each pupil can be included as part of a class poster, which could include photos or pictures of each pupil as well as their star strengths. Another way I like to get students to analyse the relationships between story characters is to get them to see that the characters in the story have different points of view and will see the events of the story accordingly. Listening to just one point of view in the story influences how we, the reader, see the events in the plot. To be more critical thinkers, we have to be aware of different points of view and draw our own conclusions from what we hear. Traditional stories can be a really fun way of doing this, as they are usually told very firmly from one point of view, that of the hero or heroes. So, for example, Hansel and Gretel in the story Hansel and Gretel, or Little Red Riding Hood in the story of Little Red Riding Hood. They are put into the danger by the actions of the villain. In the story of Little Red Riding Hood, this is the big bad wolf, and we root for our heroes to succeed to defeat and punish the villain. Fair enough, we might think, considering the actions of the wolf in the story of Little Red Riding Hood. After all, he tricks Little Red Riding Hood by asking her where she is going, then running to the grandmother's cottage himself, scaring the grandmother and putting on her clothes, and then trying to trick Little Red Riding Hood so that he can eat her. But to get students thinking more critically, we can get them to try and imagine how it feels to be the wolf. What is his side of the story? Can they think about the story again from the wolf's point of view? So you might ask the question, why does the wolf act the way he does? And start eliciting ideas from the class as a whole, and then divide them into groups to come up with more ideas that they can share. So, for example, maybe the wolf was just very hungry. Maybe there are too many new cottages in the forest and he can't find enough food. Maybe he smelt cooking coming from the grandmother's cottage and he couldn't resist it. Maybe it was an accident. He didn't mean to scare the grandmother and then he just panicked. Of course, there's no right answer to this activity. The idea is for your young learners to see that there is another way of seeing the story that we aren't told about, and that is the wolf's point of view. Critical thinkers are aware of these different points of view and they draw their own conclusions from considering them. Hearing or thinking about the wolf's side of the story might make us more sympathetic to him, and then we might draw different conclusions about the ending of the story. For example, do we still think that Red Riding Hood should punish the wolf if we feel more sympathy for him? What could she do instead? As well as analysing and understanding connections and relationships between people, stories can also guide young learners to see the patterns in a sequence of events through the plot of the story and understand why things happen, and crucially, then also how their own actions may influence events. And we'll look at this using the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, the plot of which will be familiar to many of you, but which I'll summarise as we look at the next activity. The first step after reading or sharing the story with your young learners is to get them to think about the sequence of events in the plot. And we can do this with a simple sequencing activity. So here I've broken the main elements of the story into 10 sentences and jumbled the order for students to rearrange. If we read the story in the correct order, we will have the basic sequence of events. Jack and his mother are very poor. One day, Jack sells their cow at market and buys some beans. His mother is very angry and throws the beans out of the window. The beans are magic beans, and a giant beanstalk grows. Jack climbs the beanstalk and sees a castle. He finds a giant and a goose in the castle. The goose lays golden eggs, so the giant is very rich. Jack takes the goose and escapes from the castle. The giant is very angry and chases him. Jack escapes down the beanstalk with the goose. But then, in a critical thinking approach to the story, we want our young learners to see the patterns between these effects and these events and understand why things happen. So, to deepen this understanding, we can apply the reading strategy of cause and effect. Cause, the reason why something happens; effect, the thing that happens as a result. So here we can give them a matching activity where they match up the causes of each event in the story, the reason they happened, with the events themselves, which are the effects. So when they've matched the events up, we see that Jack and his mother are very poor. So Jack sells their cow at market. Jack buys some beans with the money from the cow. So his mother is very angry. His mother throws the beans out of the window. So a beanstalk grows. The goose in the castle lays golden eggs. So the giant is very rich. Jack takes the goose. So the giant is very angry and chases him. A simple activity, but in doing it, learners are getting a deeper understanding of the pattern of events in the story, how they are connected, and also how the actions of people, in this case the character Jack, can impact on and cause other events. For example, of course the giant is angry and chases Jack at the end of the story. Jack has stolen his goose that lays golden eggs. And this is why cause and effect is one of my favourite elements of critical thinking. I think it's so important for young learners to understand the impact of their actions on others and the world, because understanding this will help them to choose to act in a way that helps others as well as the world we all live in, or at least so we hope. So let's look at a couple of activities to take their understanding of cause and effect out from the story and apply it to another context. And the first is a social responsibility activity, focusing on how our actions can impact on other people. Find a photo or a picture that shows a child who is sad. Give them a name or ask your students to, and then ask, why is Ben sad? Students can then work together to guess some different possible causes of his sadness and then compare their ideas with others in the class. So, for example, one suggestion might be that Ben's friend isn't at school today and he feels lonely. Students can then imagine that Ben is in their own class and think about the effect their own actions may have on him to cheer him up. You can use a picture of the same boy looking happy, or alternatively just a smiley face emoji as I've done here. Then ask, how can we make Ben happy? Once again, students can work together to suggest different ideas and then share their ideas with the class. For example, one idea might just be, we can ask Ben to play with us. A simple activity in the process of which students are analysing and thinking of reasons why something has happened, but also positive actions they can take themselves to influence events and change them for the better. A principle, of course, which also applies to wider contexts, such as how our actions impact the environment, which in the climate crisis we are facing, we can't emphasise to our young learners enough. So we can do a similar activity where we give students an environmental issue and ask them to think about the causes, as well as ways that their actions can impact the environment in a more positive way. A simple focus might be to look at the problem of pollution, show a picture of a beach covered in rubbish, and ask, why is the beach dirty? And get pupils thinking about what has caused the problem. Then ask, how can we clean the beach? And get pupils thinking about the positive action they can take, which will keep the beach clean. This can be a discussion activity, or they can complete a cause and effect chart in the same way. Their ideas might include a clean the beach activity, or they might think about not leaving rubbish in the first place and taking it home with them, or perhaps cutting down on plastic waste by using reusable water bottles and bags, and also about raising awareness, encouraging others to do the same. It could also then spark a Clean the Playground project for them to cause improvements in their own local environment, their school. Finally, through the adventures of their characters, stories provide young learners with a wide range of problems and solutions. We can lead them to evaluate these solutions themselves and then apply their ideas in problem-solving activities of their own. Problems and solutions are an integral part of most story arcs, as we can see from this story plot diagram, the story mountain. In the rising action of a typical story arc, the characters will come up against some kind of problem that gets bigger as they reach the climax of the story. They have to find a solution to the problem to move towards the ending of the story. It's this problem that makes a story exciting and makes us want to read it. We want to know the solution the characters will come up with and whether they will succeed at the end of the story. The problems in fairy stories usually involve some danger that the heroes have to overcome. There might be one main problem or danger, as in Little Red Riding Hood, where the main problem is the big bad wolf who wants to eat her. Or there might be a series of problems for the characters to overcome, as we can see when we think of the story of Hansel and Gretel. So let's look at some key problems that Hansel and Gretel face in the story. Hansel and Gretel go into a dark forest and they might get lost. The children are hungry in the forest and they don't have anything to eat. The witch in the gingerbread house wants to eat the children. And if that's not enough, the children's family are very poor. First of all, we would get students to identify the solutions that were applied to each of the problems in the story. And again, we can do this with the matching activity. So for example, Hansel and Gretel go into a dark forest and might get lost. So Hansel drops pieces of bread and makes a path for them. The children are hungry in the forest, so they start to eat the windows and doors of a gingerbread house. The witch in the gingerbread house wants to eat the children, so Gretel pushes the witch into a cupboard and locks her in. The children's family are very poor, so Hansel and Gretel takes the money they find back home. Then to dig deeper and use critical thinking, we might ask students to evaluate the ideas used by the characters to solve their problems and think about what they might have done in their place. Avoiding some moral ambiguity in the story, I'm going to just focus on Hansel's solution to the problem of getting lost in the forest by making a path from pieces of bread. And you'll remember that this solution doesn't work for Hansel because some birds eat the bread and so the path disappears. Write the problem and solution on the board and then ask questions to get students to evaluate Hansel's solution to the problem. Did the solution solve the problem? Why not? What could they do instead? Do they have a better idea? Students can then think of different solutions, which might range from simply using different materials for the path, for example, stones or string or anything else a bird wouldn't eat. Or they could be something like climbing a tall tree to get a bird's eye view of their way home. Or they might be ideas for trying to avoid the problem in the first place. So, for example, they could ask their parents to go into the forest with them, or they could think of other ways that they can get more food for the family, such as growing food in their garden or making things to sell at market. And then, as before, pupils can vote for the best ideas. Then you might like to pick up on the idea of the children growing food in their garden and get pupils to do a creative activity where they imagine what this garden might look like. They can draw the garden and label the fruit and vegetables they are going to grow. They can also write sentences describing their garden and how it's going to help the family. For example, in a paragraph like this, which practices the structure going to. We're going to make a vegetable garden. We're going to grow fruit and vegetables in our garden. We're going to keep chickens too. Or, having evaluated Hansel's solution from the story, you can give the class an extension activity with their own problem to think about and solve. So, for example, keeping to the theme of being lost in a place they don't know, you can give students an imaginative task based on surviving and escaping from a desert island. Show students a map or a picture of an intriguing island and get them to name it. For example, they might call it Pirate Island. Then ask them to imagine they are lost on this island. How are they going to survive? What will they eat? Where will they sleep? How will they escape from the island? You can then get them to think of the things they may have to help them on the island. They can classify these into things that grow or live on the island, such as trees, leaves, and fruit, and the animals that live there, and objects that might wash up on the beach, such as various kinds of plastic, fishing lines, old wheels and tires, and old drums and other containers. This stage of the activity could be done as a class brainstorm. Older children can then work in groups or breakout rooms to decide which of the materials they are going to use and how. Then they can change groups to present their ideas and also ask and answer questions to find out more about their classmate's solution. Here we have students applying their imaginations as well as resourcefulness to come up with their own solutions to a problem. This example here is taken from the course Cambridge Primary Path, and it shows an escape raft which is made from the branches of a tree, a stick, oil drums to make it float, and a plastic sheet for a sail. So those are some of the many reading and thinking strategies that I like to use to develop critical thinking when using stories, as well as some activities to extend these same critical thinking principles to other contexts. I hope that you'll try some of these activities with your own favourite stories and see the ideas that your own young learners come up with. Thank you very much for coming to my session today. For those of you who would like to download a certificate for attending the session, you'll be able to see the download link on the screen now. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the Global Schools Festival today.